Hello again. Welcome to my channel. My name is Marty Braden. Thanks for checking me out. It's my hope that this video, as well as all my other videos in this series, satisfies your curiosity on the subjects I talk about. In particular, today's video is about irreducible complexity. But before I jump right into it, let me explain why I started this channel in the first place and why I cover the unique and important topics that I do. Recently, I finished writing a book that I titled An Atheist Delusion. It's my rebuttal to Richard Dawkins, as you know, as an evolutionary biologist and renowned atheist, his book, The God Delusion. My book is my Latter-day Saint perspective on why I believe God exists, and Richard's book is of his perspective on why he says God doesn't exist. After publishing my book, I decided to do short video reviews like this one on all the arguments Richard and I cover in our books. That way, folks like you don't have to go out and buy my book for 20 bucks. Saves you some time and money. This video you're watching now is part 81. And it's just one of a series of videos I'm doing until I've reviewed my book in its entirety. Right now we're just in the middle of starting chapter 4 and the subtitle Irreducible Complexity. So I'm going to go ahead and pick it up where I left off last time, right here. Irreducible Complexity. For this subtitle, Richard begins by talking about a book written by an unknown author who describes what he called a simple to complexity example called the Venus flowers basket. The unknown author asked this question: how can its microscopic cells collaborate to secrete 1,000,000 glassy splinters and construct such an intricate and beautiful lattice? End of the question. Richard answers his own question saying, we don't know. But then religious critics pipe up to say, we don't know either, but one thing we do know is that chance is not the likely designer. End quote. Then Richard continues, the statistical improbability of phenomena such as Eupolactalo's skeleton, that's a tough word for me, is the central problem that any theory of life must solve. Scientifically, not religiously, of course. The greater the statistical improbability, the less plausible is chance as a solution. That is what improbable means, Richard says. The candidate solutions to the riddle of improbability are not, as is falsely implied, design and chance. The problem that any theory of life must solve is the problem of how to escape from chance. The intricate elegance of flowers like the Dutchman's pipe move us to ask, did all of this happen by chance? Well, I'd also interject there and ask, why does everyone have their own unique fingerprints? Their own unique fingerprints? Is it by chance? In response to his own question, Richard says, of course not. But once again, intelligent design is not the proper alternative to chance. Richard has given his opinion, and it's not surrounded with facts. So far, it's not. Natural selection is not only a parsimonious, which means frugal, plausible, and elegant solution. It is the only workable alternative to chance that has ever been suggested, Richard says. Once again, this is because the designer himself, herself, itself, immediately raises the bigger problem of his or her own origin. Once again, Richard's interjecting and asking the question of infinite regression, thinking that it's the theist's greatest challenge. Any entity capable of intelligently designing something as improbable as a Dutchman's pipe, or fingerprints of an entire universe for that matter, billions upon billions unique fingerprints, would have to be even more improbable than the Dutchman's pipe. Far from terminating the vicious regress problem, God aggravates it with a vengeance, Richard says. To begin with, let me answer the question put forth by the unknown author, which asked, how can its microscopic cells collaborate to secrete 1,000,000 glassy splinters and construct such an intricate and beautiful lattice? How can a random process make billions of individualized fingerprints is my question too. Well, the answer is that God created the DNA code string as part of it and all of our seed cells, so that the complex cells directives, let me move this a little bit, the cell's complex directives were in each cell from their very inception, or fertilization, or activation, or however you want to define their beginnings, directing every cell's development and ultimately do the collaborative work of secreting glassy splinters or individualizing all of our fingerprints. This is how all life was organized and designed, be it simple or complex. And it is not by chance or evolution's natural selections, undirected, unguided, mindless process, or even by the Big Bang's mindless and haphazard directing of everything that comes forth in our universe, all from a singularity explosion that somehow initiated the process of evolution and its simple to complex climb up the mountain of natural selection that Richard calls Mount Improbable. Boiling down Richard's argument to simpler terms, he is saying that if you believe the improbability that God created or organized such incredible things like the Dutchman's pipe, the dragon's fly wing, a bacteria flagellar motor, the eagle's eyes, or billions of fingerprints, you also have to believe that God has to be even more incredibly magnificent and improbable than any of these incredible creations. In short, Richard's mind, he says wet brain and not his mind because he doesn't believe mind exists, just cannot comprehend that anything, a god or otherwise, can be that astonishingly intelligent and glorious. To him, it's just too improbable. But on the other hand, Richard also says that if you allow billions of years for the process of natural selection to direct these astonishing creations developments so that they produce enough iterations through millions of parental mutations, you can move the simple onto complexity quite easily, taking it up the gradual side of Mount Improbable. This is imagery that Richard uses as a metaphor. That's the beauty of natural selection, Richard says. But as to YouTube video on origins said, go back and look at that video that I said in an earlier video of mine, the math does not add up, and we'll get into that here in a moment. Again, I ask, where is the proof of this workable process in action around us today? If it were a true theory, then shouldn't there still be millions of examples in varying stages of this kind of complex mutation going on right now, all around us? From simple offspring as well as every iteration stage in between, on up to and including thousands of finished, new kind examples of full complexity. If not, then why not? Why did natural selection decide to stop its process in every single kind on this planet? The answer to me is obvious. It's because only finished or complete kinds existed in the first place. There are no examples from the millions of species that we can point to as incomplete kinds. Kinds still in their evolutionary stages as incomplete creations. Richard might use the flatworm, the platyhelminth, and its unfinished so-called imperfect eyes, it was on my little thumbnail for this video floating in the screen, as one such example. But this example assumes that the worm's eyes are unfinished, imperfect, which they are not. Their eyes work exactly as their creator intended them to work in the kind of environment that they were created to live in. Did this so-called workable process somehow decide by itself, like a mind decides, to all of a sudden stop directing the mutation going on within every single kind and their species? Because every species within every kind of creation had actually achieved perfection, so that the process said, they're finished, done. Maybe this happened, say, 6,000 years ago. Did it somehow know they were all finished and good, like God said? Was its unintended, unguided, undirected, mindless, ungoal reached so that it no longer had to do its survival of the fittest decision making using its unguided, brainless, unintended process? How did this mindless, unguided, unintended, workable process even come to know it had achieved the unguided, unintended, ungoal of perfection or finished creations for every last one of the thousands of kinds on this planet? I mean, really, come on, man. God said it is finished and good, not some false concept that somehow is able to think, evaluate, and decide something is finished or not. Good grief. Richard went on to say natural selection is a cumulative process which breaks the problem of improbability, isn't that big problem of improbability, up into small pieces, each of the small pieces being slightly improbable, but not prohibitively so. When large numbers of these slightly improbable events are stacked up in a series, the end product in the accumulation is very, very improbable indeed. Doesn't the idea of thought process of breaking something into pieces take a mind? How does a mindless, undirected wet brain with no hands get trillions of unintended neurons to continually bounce around as unguided and undirected events and then begin all of a sudden to stack them up into smaller pieces? Richard calls it a cumulative process. How does an unguided, unintended, mindless process even know it's time to choose to break up this so-called problem of improbability into smaller pieces? How does it choose to break up these pieces into smaller, less improbable pieces? And what, in the wet brain, is making these incredible decisions, and how is it making them? What does slightly improbable even mean? What is a slightly improbable event? How does the process even know to stack them up in a series and not stack them in some other way or order and not cause chaos? I'd like to see anything, let alone an unguided, undirected, non-mind idea, do such a thing. If it's so-called workable process like Richard says it is, it should be able to be duplicated and tested in a lab, or however the test would be done by scientists in this way, right? They always talk about the scientific method. Well, scientists have never been able to test or duplicate, let me just change this theory at any time or in any way, shape, or form. And who or what created this workable process called natural selection? Shouldn't Richard's infinite regression question or argument be applied to the natural selection situation like he's applying it to the God hypothesis? Who or what is the causal cause of natural selection? And how can it be infinite ex nihilo? Do you say, poof, it's alive, Richard? Do you say, poof, it's alive? Really? If you postulate that it's all the stuff stored in the brain of each of these participants, animals, over the many multi-millions of years and their iterations that causes each sets of their multiple parents to produce offspring with the next mutated improved cells or improved DNA code arrangements in them, you'd be wrong. It's impossible. And that's because with just one chemical letter of the ACGT in the DNA code getting off kilter or out of its intended sequence, one letter, it keeps the cell from even getting off the ground, so to speak, so that it can't form the next series of proteins needed for it to grow into the new mutated iteration. It simply dies before it can duplicate itself. It's within hours. It takes too much time because these broken cells die, like I said, within hours. This challenge of DNA sequencing, that's what it's called, simply means a cell would cease until the next so-called unguided, undirected, non-mind beginnings of the potential offspring cells provided by its parents, or maybe a new set of parents and a different progression of parents that have a better chance of producing the right cells with the right kind of mutated DNA code sequencing string, generated over and over again until the right mutation just happens to survive. Really? A mutation that didn't misarrange the DNA sequence, yet was able to somehow mutate it correctly. Talk about improbable. Sheesh. The fact is, it's impossible for this so-called workable process to produce multiple mutations of tiny, minuscule changes with its tens of thousands of desired protein formations accidentally arranging themselves correctly. And that's because of this busting the DNA sequence fact. Remember, it's being a 4 billion letter word, the longest word in the universe. I ask you, who is being improbable here? God's DNA and its sequencing that he set up, or Richard's theory of natural selection? The more probable hypothesis is that the incredibly intelligent, brilliantly sophisticated mind, even the mind of God, is a creative genius that put the right information, hear that, the right information into all his creations, respecting DNA strings. All in the correct order, making every cell perfectly designed for the life of that animal or creature to launch. And these perfect or complete cells grow to become beautiful, finished, complete creations from their beginnings, and those beginnings were organized before their pre-fall state and not after the fall. Those beginnings, all that information was in the two parental cells that started that process. Everything they needed to become the full adult of what they are were in those two cells, the genetic code in those two cells. Now, after the fall, all life of every kind fell into a state of mortality where the process of death came into the picture, as well as the possibility of disease and deformity. God decreed that death would be the end of all his creations as a key part of their existence here on earth. It's part of his plan. As a result of this decree, Adam chose to transgress God's law, bringing death upon himself and his posterity. However, the earth and all things upon it will again receive their paradisical glory, which God promised all his creations as well. Now, let's discuss irreducible complexity with that foundation laid. Irreducible complexity, capital I, capital C, is the argument that certain biological systems like the eagle's eye cannot have evolved by successive small modifications to pre-existing functional systems through a natural selection process. And that's because a less complex system would not be able to function without any one of its specific individual parts being in place from the beginning. Just like the DNA example I just ran through, every part of an irreducibly complex system is necessary. Take away even one part or one chemical letter and the entire system will no longer work, or at least it will function poorly. Because the system's parts are so intricate and interdependent with each of its other parts, such simple or complex systems could not possibly have been the result of little iterations of unguided, undirected, unintended, yet so-called workable evolutionary processes. A very intelligent scientist, Michael J. Behe, is an American biochemist, author, and advocate of the pseudoscientific principle of intelligent design, and serves as professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He is also a senior fellow of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture at the time of my book's writing. Let me say up front, before I tell Behe's story, let me say that Richard Dawkins strongly disagrees with Behe's theories, and in particular his idea about systems not working in one part if one part isn't there to allow the whole system to function. Behe's original examples of irreducibly complex mechanisms included the bacterial flagellum of E. coli, the blood-clotting cascade cilia, and the adaptive immune system. The three of many, there could be many more. Behe argues that organs and biological features which are irreducibly complex cannot be wholly explained by current models of evolution, end quote. Charles Darwin himself said, quote, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Did you hear what Darwin himself just said? I want you to remember that this quote as we work through this argument. Bingo, I say. With this statement, Charles Darwin provided a criterion by which his theory of evolution could be falsified, meaning it could be made to be false. His logic was simple. We need a crane, not a skyhook, for only a crane can do the business of working up the gradually and plausibly from simplicity to otherwise improbable complexity. Let me continue here. In other words, since evolution is a gradual process in which slight modifications produce advantages for survival, it being a role that has to be there, it cannot produce complex structures in a short amount of time. Time truly is the life or death enemy of evolution. Evolution requires a step-by-step process which may gradually build up and modify complex structures over a very, very long period of time. Excuse me. In other words, construct the structure over a long period of time. And so it cannot produce or construct such structures suddenly. Darwin, meet Michael Behe. Michael Behe claims to have shown exactly what Darwin claimed would destroy his theory of evolution through a concept Behe calls irreducible complexity. In simple terms, this idea applies to any system of interacting parts in which the removal of any one part destroys the function of the entire system. An irreducibly complex system then requires each and every component to be in place, listen to this, to be in place before it will function. Behe presented one simple irreducible complex system, the mousetrap, as an illustration of his argument. You need to go to YouTube and type in Unlocking the Mystery of Life. It's a fantastic video on this very subject. Excuse me, it contains 5 interdependent parts which allows it to catch mice. Before I continue, just what had to be in the minds of people to come up, they had to be dealing with an influx of mice and eating their clothes or break into a wheat barrel or something that they eat and poop and all the stuff, put them to a point we got to come up and make someone's mind go over and over and over again and get attuned to intelligence and come up in the mind an idea, a complex system, as simple as they could make it. It included the wooden platform, the spring hammer, this little spring right here, you can see that, the spring hammer, the bar which crushes the mouse, in other words, the holding bar, this right here, this special holding bar that holds this part right here. Once it's all put over and done, it holds it there, so when they click on it, boom! I tried this once and it snapped on my finger, and I didn't want to hurt myself in front of you, so that's why I'm just going to go through the parts. And a catch. Each of these components are essential. Each of them are essential for the functionality of the mousetrap. For instance, if you remove the catch, if you remove this catch right here, if you remove this the catch, you cannot set the trap, and it will never catch mice, no matter how long they may dance over the contraption. Remove the spring part, remove that spring, the hammer, flip, 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 usually back and forth. Certainly not much of a threat to the little rodents, is it? Of course, removal of the holding bar, this right here, the holding bar, will ensure that the trap never catches anything. Let me get this right back down there. There we go. Will never catch anything because there will again be no way to arm the system. Simple little 5-part mousetrap. That's a system. Note what this implies. An irreducibly complex system cannot come about in a gradual manner. One cannot begin with a wooden platform over 1,000,000 years to have the wood form itself and something cut it and form it and it's there and catch a few mice along the way. Then add the spring. Oh boy, I need to have a spring now. And catching a few more mice than before, etc., etc. No, all the components must be in place before it functions at all. A step-by-step approach to constructing such a system will result in a useless system until all the components have been added to the whole system. The system requires all the components to be added at the same time, in the right configuration, before it can work at all. How does irreducible complexity apply to biology? Well, Behe notes that early this century, before biologists really understood the cell, they had a very simplistic model of its inner workings. Without the electron microscopes, which I've talked about earlier, and the other advanced techniques that now allow scientists to peer into the inner workings of the cell, it was assumed that the cell was a fairly simple blob of protoplasm. Behe continues, the living cell was a black box, something that could be observed to perform various functions, while its inner workings were unknown and mysterious. Therefore, it was easy and justifiable to assume that the cell was a simple collection of molecules. But not anymore. That's an understatement. Technology advances have provided detailed information about the inner workings of the cell. End quote. Michael Denton, in his book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. That's why I titled this video, A Theory in Crisis, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. He stated, although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than, and then some mathematical formula of grams, really tiny, each is in effect a veritable, listen to this, micro-miniaturized factory, a micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up of altogether of 100,000 million atoms. 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. I have to say this. Talk about a tinker toy. Good grief. In a word, the cell is complicated. Very, very complicated, and certainly not simple. In fact, Michael Behe asserts that the complicated biological structures in a cell exhibit the exact same irreducible complexity that we saw in the mousetrap example. In other words, they are all or nothing. Either everything is there and it works, or when something is missing, it doesn't work. It was either in the two parental cells that let it grow to maturity because it was all contained in there, It didn't go to this cell and billions of new cells. And oh, now it's got the little thing hanging down. I'm not wondering what that's for. Oh, that's the thing that's going to be tied to the spring, but it's not yet to come. Come on. Keep in mind that the 12 main parts of a cell, of a single cell, are made up of hundreds of parts themselves. Leaving just one of those hundreds of parts that make up these 12 main parts would leave the cell functionless, unable to function. As we saw before, such a system cannot be constructed in a gradual manner. It simply won't work until all the components are present. And Darwin's theory has no mechanism for adding all the components at once. Remember, Darwin's theoretical mechanism or crane of natural selection is one of gradual mutations and iterations leading to improved fitness for survival principles. Fitness for survival, it has to have that, or it's a breaking point for the natural selection rule of evolution for survival over millions of years. A less than complete system of this nature simply will not function, and it certainly won't help the organism to survive the rule of natural selection. Indeed, having a half-formed and hence a non-functional system would actually hinder the cell's survival and would be selected against. Being broken, it couldn't survive. Behe is not the only scientist to recognize irreducible complexity in nature, end quote. In 1986, Michael J. Katz, in his Templates and the Explanation of Complex Patterns, Cambridge University Press, back in 1986, wrote the following. In the natural world, there are many patterns assembly systems for which there is no simple explanation. There are useful scientific explanations for these complex systems, but the final patterns that they produce are so heterogeneous, large and diverse, that they cannot effectively be reduced to smaller or less intricate predecessor components. Listen to that. They cannot effectively be reduced to smaller or less intricate predecessor components. As I will argue, these patterns are, in a fundamental sense, irreducibly complex, end quote. Katz continues stating this sort of complexity is found in biology. He says, cells and organisms are quite complex by all pattern criteria. They are built of heterogeneous elements arranged in heterogeneous configurations, diverse in character such as solid, liquid, or gaseous as one example. And they do not self-assemble. They do not self-assemble. In other words, it can't cause events to stack into a series as Dawkins suggested it could, nor direct or self-assemble itself, right? That's what it's saying. One cannot stir together the parts of a cell or of an organism and spontaneously assemble a neuron or a walrus. To create a cell or an organism, one needs a pre-existing cell or a pre-existing organism with its attendant complex templates. And we can't forget the life energy it needs to come to life as well. A fundamental characteristic of the biological realm is that organisms are complex patterns, and for their creation, life is required extensively and essentially maximal templates. That's what's needed. Behe presents several examples of irreducibly complex systems to prove his point, but I'll just focus on one. The cilia are hair-like structures which are used by animals and plants to move fluid over various surfaces. For example, cilia in your respiratory tree sweep mucus towards the throat and thus promote elimination of contaminants. Phlegm, and by single-celled organisms to move through the water. Cilia are like oars, listen to that, are like oars which contain their own mechanism for bending. The mechanism involves tiny rod-like structures called microtubules that are arranged in a ring. Adjacent microtubules are connected to each other by two types of bridges connecting type parts, a flexible linker bridge and an arm that can walk up the neighboring microtube. The cilia bend by activating the walker arms, and the sliding motion that this tends to generate is converted to a bending motion by the flexible linker bridges, which then moves it along. Thus, the cilium has several essential components: stiff microtubules, linker bridges, and the motors in the form of walker arms. While my description is greatly simplified, Behe notes that over 200 separate proteins have been identified in this particular system. These three components form the basic system and show what is required for functionality. Think of being a cell mechanic, like a car mechanic, and having to check all 200 proteins or parts to find out what's wrong. For without one of these components, just one, the system simply will not function. And we're supposed to believe that all these thousands upon thousands, if not millions, of decision-making steps came about as a result of a singularity blast in our outer space. Then that put this single life-bearing cell on our planet. Come on, man. Really? If you believe that, I've got some property in Florida I'd like to sell you. Just kidding, just kidding. We can't evolve a cilium by starting with microtubules alone, because the microtubules will be fixed and rigid, not much good for moving around. Adding the flexible linker bridges to the system will not do any good either. There is still no motor, and the cilia still will not bend. If we have microtubes and the walker arms, the motors, but no flexible linker arms, the microtubules will keep on sliding past each other until they float away from each other and are lost. This is only one of many, many, many biochemical systems that Behe discusses in his book, Darwin's Black Box. Other examples of irreducible complexity include the light sensing system in animal eyes, the transport system within the cell, that bacterial flagellum, and the blood clotting system, just to name a few. All consist of a very complex system of interacting parts which cannot be simplified while maintaining functionality by reducing the system back to its tiniest of tiny parts. Since the publication of Darwin's Black Box in 1986, Behe has refined the definition of irreducible complexity. In 1996, he wrote that any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. Evidence for Intelligent Design from Biochemistry, that's the book. A speech given at the Discovery Institute's God and Culture Conference back in August 10, 1996 in Seattle, Washington. By defining irreducible complexity in the terms of non-functionality, Behe cast light on the fundamental problem with evolutionary theory. Evolution cannot produce something where there would be a non-functional intermediate. It can't produce something that would have that. This is just one of the many of the rules that natural selection must follow, or it falls apart. Natural selection only preserves or selects those structures which are functional. It is not functional. If it is not functional, it cannot be naturally selected, because it would prove it's dysfunctional and thus not fit for preserving one's survival, which is natural selection's chief principle and rule, which supposedly gave rise to its existence. Thus, Behe's latest definition of irreducible complexity is as follows. An irreducibly complex evolutionary pathway is one that contains one or more unselected steps, that is, one or more necessary but unselected mutations. The degree of irreducible complexity is the number of unselected steps or mutations in the pathway. And that's in the same book I just mentioned. Evolution simply cannot produce complex structures in a single generation as would be required for the formation of irreducibly complex systems. Another rule required by natural selection. To imagine that a chance set of mutations, its cells being provided by one or both parents, would produce all 200 proteins required or cilia function in a single generation, coming out of the blue and then in one generation, stretches the imagination beyond the breaking point. And yet producing one or a few of these proteins at a time in standard Darwinian fashion would convey no survival advantage, because those few proteins would have no function. Indeed, they would constitute a waste of energy for the cell to even produce them. Therefore, once again, this goes against natural selection rules for survival, so that they would be discarded. Darwin recognized this as a potential threat to his theory of evolution. He said, "The issue that could completely disprove my idea." So the question must be raised, has Darwin's theory of evolution absolutely broken down? According to Michael Behe, Stephen Myers, and other eminent scientists, the answer is a resounding yes. Richard Dawkins' stated, however, Darwin devoted an entire chapter of The Origin of the Species to difficulties on the theory of descent with modifications. And it is fair to say that this brief chapter anticipated, he says, and disposed of every single one of the alleged difficulties that have since been produced. Come on, Richard. Every single difficulty? Darwin's Origin of Species was written in 1859. So I respectfully disagree with you, Richard, on your claim that every single difficulty since 1859 has been resolved. Consider all that's been discovered since 1859. You go back to my list of pages in my introduction and talked about pages and pages of discovery chart, including starting on page 199 of my book. Richard continued saying, no one has found, nor has he himself found, a single case of irreducible complexity that disproves Darwin's statement that everything has been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, coming by way of the smooth gradient of Mount Improbable, I suppose, which is an example from his book, Climbing Mount Improbable. In another one of Richard's books titled Climbing Mount Improbable, Richard wrote an entire chapter on the eye and the wing in order to demonstrate how easy it was for them to develop by slow or even maybe not so slow gradual degrees, iterations. Richard also mentions that flatworm's eye, I told you so, that flatworm's eye example I mentioned earlier as being one of such examples of how it went from simple to complex, it being far from the perfection of an eagle's eye, yet functional for its purpose. Okay, the eagle's eye is magnificent, and the flatworm's eye, the petty plymouth or whatever, that little two-eyed on a flat surface you saw, that one is imperfect, so it's an example of natural selection happening and evolving, and how many more millions of years they'll finally get to be where it has the eagle's eye. Richard uses it as the example of an eye being in the process of evolution improvement. Good grief. If you accept that, so be it. I can make a few arguments regarding these so-called examples offered up by Richard, but I'll let you make the decision if you want to believe Richard's example of something living today, that is, with its so-called imperfect eye, in a stage of evolution, and that it will contribute to other offspring that will be part of the millions of gradations or iterations yet to take place, which iterations are required to take place over the next millions of years before the flatworm's so-called imperfect eyes reach its completion. So far, this seems to be the one and only example that I've found that Richard and other scientists have held up as proof of natural selection working today. Richard, you've got to be kidding me. What happened to the eminent intelligence self-aggrandizing here? Casey Luskin wrote the article titled Evolution and the Problem of Non-Functional Intermediates in 1980. Behe's articles regarding irreducible complexity were written 137 years after Darwin's time in 1859. Richards first published his book, The God Delusion, in 2006. And since then, 2006, multiple books like Stephen Meyer's Signature in the Cell in 2010, and Darwin's Doubt in 2013, Return of the God Hypothesis in 2021, and many more books have come on the scene describing the many new discoveries that relate to this very interesting topic. Certainly, in my opinion, neither Richard nor anyone else still can claim that Darwin anticipated and disposed of every single one of the alleged difficulties that have since been brought to light right up to the present day. Come on. Since Richard, to this very day, still supports his claim that Darwin's theory of evolution has disposed of every single one of the alleged difficulties that have been put forth opposing Darwin's theory, when in fact there have been hundreds come forth, including the ones I have listed here. It certainly is evidence to me that Richard, in my humble opinion, is indeed suffering from what I have been calling an atheist delusion. I suggest you, my viewers, go on and read another article that I think lends additional support for Behe's conclusion regarding irreducible complexity and functionality of systems, which breaks down Darwin's theory of evolution and its tenet for natural selection, piece by piece. You can do a search for, here it is, Evolution and the Problem of Non-Functional Intermediates by Casey Luskin. Call that up. It's great. Now, I'm going to stop there. I went over, but it gives us what we needed to get through this subtitle, and it's all on the same thing, so I went long, but it's here. It's recorded for those who want to watch it. So comments, thoughts, questions, put them in. I'll get to them as quick as possible. I love to answer. I love to see the dialogue, and I appreciate you clicking the subscribe button so that it can get this message out to many, many more people. It truly does help. But until next time, where we'll talk about the worship of gaps, another powerful argument. It's going to be an interesting discussion. But until then, I want to wish you continued success. Goodbye.